Shalom people. So I happened to catch this little segment here on Michael Strahan, former NFL player turned TV presenter, and it turns out that he has royal European lineage leading all the way back to Charlemagne. So the question is, how does a black man have royal European lineage leading all the way back to Charlemagne? Now, of course, some of you may already know why that may be the case, but with that being said, what I'm going to do, I'm going to play this little segment and I'm going to give my commentary over it and we're going to see where it leads us.
Now, an incredible journey to learn more about my path that I recently got the opportunity to trace. I got a chance to trace my family tree way back and then hundreds of years back in a new episode of Finding Your Roots that airs tonight. And even I was shocked by some of the results. Check it out. It's the show that helps us trace our ancestry, and now it's my turn to find my roots. Just over 150 years ago, my family made history in Texas. Shankleville community, named for Jim and Winnie Shankle, known as first Newton County blacks to buy land to become local leaders after gaining freedom by emancipation.
Almost overnight, they went from being a slave to a landowner. That's amazing.
Now, before we even get to the Shankles, brothers, sisters, so-called black men, so-called black women, the things that I'm about to tell you, the things that I'm about to say, it's going to sound absolutely crazy to you. You're going to be saying to yourself, this dude KMZ is a straight bug out. He's crazy, he's deranged, he needs to be locked up, he's a conspiracy theorist, he hates his African roots, he hates his blackness, he hates being black, yada yada yada. Now the reason why some of you brothers and sisters are going to have that mentality to what I'm about to say is because you have been conditioned with false history. You have been conditioned with lies, fables, and narratives concerning black history. So when truth comes out, when real history comes out, brothers and sisters, it's going to sound absolutely ludicrous to you. So with that being said, what is the widely spread, accepted mainstream media narrative concerning black history? All dark-hued people only come from Africa. The white man invaded Africa in the 1600s and he kidnapped 100 trillion billion black people, or whatever hyperinflated number the Caucasian decides to use. He drugged them all the way from Africa and put them to work as slaves on plantations in America, or pretty much anywhere in the world. Basically, if you find a large group of black people that's not on the continent of Africa, the only reason why that they are there is because they got drugged there by the slave trade. But sticking with America, if you was to ask your average so-called black man or black woman, how did black people get to America? He or she 100% of the time is going to say they got drugged there on slave ships by the white man. Our people have been inundated with slave history only. And oh yeah, how could I forget Black History Month, or as I like to call it, the remembrance of all black people ever were a bunch of slaves and servants. Now, of course, on Black History Month, they're going to throw in the usual. Martin Luther King, Civil Rights Movement, Rosa Parks sat on a bus, peaceful protesting, marching, and so forth. Of course, they're going to throw bones here and there. A black person invented this, a black person pioneered this, but for the most part, it's just slavery and servitude. They should just call it Slave History Month because, truth be told, our people love being slaves. Yes, you heard me correctly. Now, you may be saying to yourself, is this brother trying to make light of slavery and the hardships that our people went through? Is this brother trying to mock the ancestors? Is this brother trying to make light about the white man whipping us and putting us in chains and making us pick cotton? Look, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you guys don't truly understand the nuance of servitude concerning so-called black people. But going back to the widely spread, accepted mainstream media narrative concerning black history, black people were in Africa chilling in huts. The white men came over there, enslaved them, moved them around, put them to work in plantations. When it comes to the ancient world, black people didn't really start, pioneer, or invent, or were the starters of any ancient civilizations. All of those ancient civilizations, for the most part, were Caucasian or other races. Basically, all you ever were black people, you're just a slave race. And these narratives false narratives, I should say, are reinforced through pop culture, through TV shows, through movies, through documentary channels, through textbooks, through the school system, universities, Ivy League schools, and so forth. But black people, now listen to me very carefully. The white man did not go to Africa in the 1600s, kidnap and enslave 100 gazillion billion black people. You want to know why? Because the white man wasn't even in rulership in the 1600s. Black people were still in mass rulership in the 1600s. But of course, the mainstream media narrative has taught you black people solely got to America on slave ships by the white man. Look, some of you black people were already in America as the indigenous Aboriginal people, and a large majority of you actually didn't come from Africa, you came from Europe. Now, that's not to say that no black people ever came from Africa to America, but a large portion of you did come from Europe. So you may be asking, how did black people come over from Europe? Well, you came over as an amalgamation of a lot of different things. You came over as pirates, you came over as explorers, commercial traders. You also came over fleeing all the wars that were going on in Europe. You came as indentured servants, criminals, convicts, prisoners of war, but ultimately you also came as the original colonist. Brothers, sisters, black people were in the seats of power during the 1600s. The monarchy was so-called black people. King James, his son King Charles, George I, II, and III. Yes, all of them were black men. Heck, even George Washington, yes, George Washington himself was a so-called black man. And this should not come as a surprise to my regular viewers. But like I said, for those of you black people who have just discovered my channel, it's going to sound absolutely crazy to you. So with everything that I've just stated, it's going to raise a lot of questions. And one of the main questions is going to be, technically, did black people start the slave trade? Yes, they did. And it was mainly preceding to the black Europeans, mainly the Portuguese and the Spanish. Now, even going back like 100 years before the 1600s, you had the Portuguese who had colonies in West Africa. Now you had Charles V, I've mentioned this in past videos. You had Charles V, yes, who himself was also a so-called black man, and his image should be on the screen. And no, that image is not Christopher the Moor, it's not an African in Renaissance Europe, and it's not the bodyguard of Charles V like they're going to tell you. They titled these things to hide the identity of the person who we are looking at. Yes, that image is the real image of Charles V. But with that being said, you had Charles V who granted a charter to transport African slaves to the Spanish American colonies. But quickly, going back to the image on Charles V, I'm currently working on a video on the real images of the black nobility of Europe, as well as their skin complexions, proving that they were so-called black. Now, unfortunately, that video has taken me way longer than I thought it would have to produce. It was supposed to be last month's video. But with that being said, in the meantime, I highly suggest you brothers and sisters go through my catalog of videos. For those of you who are new, I've made playlists and I've titled them so it's easier for you to follow along. But let's get back to Michael Strahan. Now, on one side of Michael Strahan's family, he descends from the Shankles, James and Winnie Shanko, who founded Shankoville, which was a freedman town, and it was established after the Emancipation Proclamation. And speaking of the Emancipation Proclamation, the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln, what is the widespread accepted mainstream media narrative? Abraham Lincoln was the one that freed Negroes out of slavery. If it wasn't for Abraham Lincoln, black people might still be in slavery. The North marched to the South, freed Negroes from slavery, and stuck it to the white slave owners. You know the story. That had nothing to do with freeing black people out of servitude. First and foremost, when it comes to the South, there were black slave owners, there were white slave owners, there were black slave owners who owned both black and white slaves and vice versa. There were black slaves, they were white slaves. They want to work this mental psychosis onto black people and have them think that from the 1600s, every single black man, woman, and child were enslaved all the way up to the Emancipation Proclamation. Look, when it comes to the North/Union, they wanted to preserve the Union. The North wanted economical control over the southern states. Now the South wanted to govern itself separate from the North. There probably would have even been a war if the North didn't invade the South. It was over money, power, commerce, and political control, nothing to do with freeing Negroes from slavery. Now, just to hammer the point in even further, when it comes to Abraham Lincoln himself, Abraham Lincoln also was a so-called black man. As a matter of fact, at the age of 16, Abraham Lincoln was described as being 6 feet tall, dark-skinned, and bony. In his older age, he was described as having dry, tough wrinkles and being very dark-skinned. Real history is a mind trip. Now, this shouldn't come as a shock to my regular viewers, but for those of you who are new, like I said, you're going to think that I'm absolutely crazy with the things that I'm about to tell you. So this is the hidden Lincoln from the letters and papers of William H. Herndon. So Josh C. Richardson says, my father came to Spencer County, Indiana in 1828. Lincoln was tall and raw-boned at 18. When 16 years of age, he was 6 feet high. He was somewhat bony and raw, dark-skinned. He was quick and moved with energy. He never idled away his time. When out of regular work, he would help and assist the neighbors. He was exceedingly studious. I knew him well. He wrote me a copy in my writing copybook which ran thus: good boys who to their books apply will make great men by and by. So as you can see, Abe was described as dark-skinned. But you know what? Maybe he just had a deep, dark tan. Maybe he was just out in the sun too long. Maybe he just got sunburned. Even though all of the images show Abraham Lincoln as a pale man, that doesn't seem to matter. You know what it is? Maybe in the summertime, that's when he got his deep dark tan, and when it came to winter, he reverted back to his pale complexion. So this is Complete Prue's Works, Specimen Days and Collect, November Bows, and Goodbye My Fancy by Whitman Walt. So Abraham Lincoln, August 12th, I see the president almost every day, as I happen to live where he passes to or from his lodgings out of town. He never sleeps at the White House during the hot season, but has quarters at a healthy location some 3 miles north of the city. The Soldiers' Home, a United States military establishment. I saw him this morning about 8:30 coming into business, riding on Vermont Avenue, near L Street. He always has a company of 25 or 30 cavalry, with sabers drawn and held upright over their shoulders. They say this god was against his personal wish, but he let his counselors have their way. The party makes no great show in uniform or horses. Mr. Lincoln, on the saddle, generally rides a good-sized, easy-going grey horse, is dressed in plain black, somewhat rusty and dusty, wears a black stiff hat, and looks about as ordinary in attire as the commonest man. A lieutenant with yellow straps rides at his left, and following behind, 2 by 2, come the cavalrymen in their yellow striped jackets. They are generally going at a slow trot, as that is the pace set them by the one they wait upon. the sabres and accoutrements clank, and the entirely ornamental cortege, if I've pronounced that correctly, as it trots towards Lafayette Square arouses no sensation. Only some curious stranger stops and gazes. I see very plainly Abraham Lincoln's dark brown face with the deep cut lines, the eyes always to me with a deep latent sadness in the expression. So I mentioned earlier that people do not really understand the nuances when it comes to black people in servitude positions. They will show you images of black people doing manual labor from the 16, 17, 1800s, and they've trained you to think that those are black people who got dragged from Africa and that they were forced to do that work. A lot of that can actually come in the form of indentured servitude. A lot of those people could have just been employees who got paid to do that manual labor. They could have also been indentured because they owed a debt and they had to pay off that debt by working the land. They could also have been indentured in the form of a criminal or a convict, and they were forced to work the plantations to serve out their prison sentence. All of these types of nuances have been completely scrubbed out when it comes to black people. But just to get further context on black slave owners and indentured servitude, what I'm going to do, I'm going to play a small little segment from a video I did on Patreon titled African Americans are Aborigines, US Senator Scott Beeson and Black Slave Owners. Now the reason why that video is not on YouTube is because the video got blocked for an ending segment that I used. So if you want to watch the full video, it is on my Patreon at KMZ History Patreon, and the video is free. But with that being said, let's play the segment. Actually, before I play the little segment, for those of you who've already watched the video on Patreon, and if you don't want to rewatch the part on indentured servitude, just skip to the 34 minutes and 50-second mark.
Que todo el mundo debería de saber.
We believe that the whole world should know that in the colonial era, Mexico was an entry point for African slaves. Our ancestors were forcibly brought here under slavery.
But images of
Yes and no. You see, the issue with the topic of slavery is that it's always one-sided. It's always the white man went into Africa and he kidnapped 100 trillion billion black people, which is false. Now, did you have slaves that came from Africa? Yes, you did. For example, going all the way back to the early 1500s, you had Charles V, by the way, who was a so-called black man. Now you might be asking to yourself, why does he keep saying over and over again that these people were black? I say that these monarchs were black for the new viewers because when I mention these monarchs, they're probably thinking I'm talking about Caucasians. So you had Charles V, who granted a charter to Lorenzo de Gorovad. Now for those who don't know, Lorenzo de Gorovad was an aristocrat and he was a member of the Habsburgs court. Now this charter granted Lorenzo permission to transport slaves from Africa into the Spanish American colonies. But when it comes to the topic of black people being dragged from Africa, it's actually the latter. The majority of slaves per se were actually enslaved on their own land, or they came from Europe as convicts and prisoners of war who had to work the plantations to serve out their prison sentence. But it's even more nuanced than that because now we have to tackle indentured servitude. And what is indentured servitude? So now this is a book called Free Black Owners of Slaves, a reappraisal of the Woodson thesis. And this is mainly for you American descendants of slaves, thinking that your great-great-great-great-grandpappy, grandmother, so on and so forth, were slaves who were owned by the white man. You're going to come to find out that your great-great-great-great-grandpappy or grandmother were actually slave owners who owned other black slaves. But on the topic of indentured servitude, you can become an indentured servant because you owe somebody a debt. I'm going to give you a modern day example. Let's just say you walked into a store and you were messing about and you knocked over a TV. but you couldn't afford to pay that TV back. Now the store owner comes to you and says, you know what? In order for you to pay off the TV, you have to work in my store for a week. And you both agree and you both set up a contract. Another example of indentured servitude comes in the form of a prisoner or a criminal. For example, you get sent over by the crown to work in the colonies or on the plantation to serve out your prison sentence. Another example of indentured servitude is in the form of an employee. You agree to work a certain amount of days, months, or years for someone and you get paid. And where do we see this in modern times? For those of you who watch wrestling like WWE, AEW, that's a form of indentured servitude where these wrestlers sign contracts, 3-year deals, 5-year deals, so on and so forth. And in the contract, it has stipulations like one of the main things in these contracts is that they are not allowed to wrestle for any other wrestling company. But you see, what the white man would do, he would take all of those examples of indentured servitude when it concerns black people and say and scrub all of that out and say that they were just slaves who came from Africa. So Carter G. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915. John Hope Franklin has described the accomplishment as launching the era of the new Negro history. Franklin wrote further, Dr. Woodson and his associates went about the task of exploiting the myths of Negro history and of putting the Negro in his rightful place in the history of this country. It is indeed true that Woodson exposed many myths about black history. However, he may also be the creator of a myth. Undergraduate history students are usually amazed to learn of the large number of freed blacks in the antebellum period. Graduate students are often surprised to learn that some of these freed blacks owned slaves. And it just reminded me of the term freedman. The term freedman does not come from the Caucasian releasing black people from slavery. It actually comes from black people releasing themselves. For example, family members will buy contracts to release their families out of servitude. You would also have people in servitude who would buy out their own contracts / freedom. Man, these notifications interrupting me. But yeah, that term freedman does not come from the white man releasing black people. So some of these free blacks owned slaves. History professors are frequently skeptical when they hear the number of free black slaveholders and the number of slaves they owned. Indeed, in 1905, Booker T. Washington wrote, "My own personal recollections bring no case in mind of free black men owning slaves, nor am I able to refer you to any books making reference to this phase of slavery, in case it did exist. Now my personal opinion is that Booker T. Washington is lying and he knows about the black slaveholders. Yet, at one time or another, free blacks owned slaves in each of the 13 original states and later in every state that countenanced slavery." Now, as most of you should already know by now, we know that the original 13 states or the 13 colonies was pretty much started by King James in Virginia. Now, while it's on the top of my mind, I just remembered when I was going over indentured servitude and I stated a form of indentured service is criminals being sent over to the colonies. You guys could go look up something called the Transportation Act of 1717. Now, this act regulated a bond system to transport criminals to the colonies in North America for indentured service, for punishment for criminals. So that is the Transportation Act of 1717. Where did these free blacks come from? Some had never been slaves. They had been indentured servants who had become free. Some had purchased their freedom. Now, this is what I was on about when I told you guys a lot of them bought themselves out of their own contracts. It had nothing to do with the white man releasing black slaves and they became freedmen. But I pretty much got what I wanted. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You guys can read it on your own time. I'm going to jump forward ahead to the slave list. So this is page 135. Free black owners of slaves. So place of residence, starting with Alabama. So Alabama, 48 free black slave owners, 197 slaves owned by free blacks. Arkansas Territory, 1 black slave owner, 8 slaves owned by free blacks. Connecticut, 1 owner, 1 slave owned. Delaware, 9 free black slave owners, 21 slaves owned by free blacks. The District of Columbia, 183 slave owners, 243 slaves owned by free blacks. Florida, 15 free black slave owners, 92 slaves owned by free blacks. Georgia, 61 free black slave owners, 207 slaves owned by free blacks. Illinois, 7 black slave owners, 11 slaves owned by free blacks. Kentucky, 120 free black slave owners, 271 slaves owned by free blacks. Louisiana, 965 free black slave owners and 4,206 slaves owned by free blacks, so on and so forth. You get the point. You guys can pause and read the rest. But for those of you brothers and sisters that subscribe to ADOS, American Descendants of Slaves, you're going to be shocked that your great-great-grandpappy grandmother owned slaves that were so-called black. So now this is another book titled Black Slave Owners, Free Black Slave Masters in South Carolina, 1790 to 1860 by Larry Koga. Now, brothers, sisters, when you find a lot of these books or historical documentation of black slave owners, you have to take them with a grain of salt, because a lot of the historians and scholars, whether they be black or white, they go on the basis, or they go off of the basis of Europe equals white people, or white people equals the Europeans. So you have to dodge a lot of the narrative. But with that being said, I've highlighted some paragraphs that I want to read out. So this is page 23, skipping down to the second paragraph. Indeed, so widespread was black slaveholding in the city of Charleston that the majority of free black heads of household owned slaves from 1820 to 1840. When the first federal census of 1790 was taken, it revealed that 36 out of 102, or 35.2%, of the free black heads of families held slaves in Charleston City. By 1800, nearly 1 out of every 3 colored heads of households were recorded with slave property. Between 1820 and 1840, the percentage of slave-holding heads of family ranged from 72.1% to 77.7%. In 1850, however, the percentage of black heads of households owning slaves was a modest 42.3%. The existence of black slaveholding in Charleston City was so visible that a northern visitor to the city commented that a number of free blacks and owned slaves themselves. This may seem strange to many northern people, especially to the class who cannot understand nor appreciate the system of labor known as slave labor. As the free black community prospered, even marginal blacks acquired the means to purchase slaves. In 1854, Rebecca Swinton, a 44-year-old black woman with no reported occupation, somehow obtained the money to purchase a 50-year-old slave named Mary for $100. Elsewhere in Charleston City, Joseph Maxwell, a black fisherman, owned 2 female slaves whose ages were 38 and 6 years old. In 1850, the only property owned by the majority of the colored masters was human chattel. For the most part, free blacks of wealth as well as those of marginal status acquired slaves and thereby contributed to the high percentage of colored heads of family who owned slaves in Charleston City. It appears that throughout most of the antebellum period, the majority of the urban black slaveholders were females. In 1820, for example, free black women represented 68.2% of the heads of families as well as 70.7% of the slaveholding heads of colored dwellings. In Charleston City, the female heads of black families dominated the black slaveholding communities. In 1850, the number of black women who owned slaves was reported at 123 by the federal census, yet only 68 black men owned slaves in the port city. By 1860, the gap between female and male slave owners gradually decreased, and within 4 more years, the number of male masters surpassed the number of female masters. So it wasn't just the men, you had a lot of black women that owned slaves also. So this next paragraph, which is on page 9, is going to back up what I was telling you guys about how you had family members who purchased other family members out of servitude. So one reason for blacks not reporting their ownership of slaves was their kinship ties to their human chattel. For example, John Morris, a free black and a wheelwright of Charleston City, purchased his 2 daughters, Rosanna and Carolina, from Josiah A. Payne for $300 in 1849. After Morris bought his 2 girls, he purchased his wife, Grace, and their son, Joseph, from William B. for $500 in 1851. Rather than tell the census taker that his wife and children were slaves, he simply stated that his loved ones were free blacks. According to the 8th federal enumeration, Morris' household consisted of his wife, Grace Morris, and their 4 children, Rosanna, Carolina, Joseph, and Peter Morris. Although he reported his family as free persons of color, he still paid the city taxes for 5 slaves. Like John Morris, some other free blacks refused to consider or refer to their family members as slaves. As a result, few of these colored slaveholders told the federal census marshals that their kinfolk were slaves. So from the same book, here's another list of black slave owners, just to name a few. Peter Jackson owned 6 slaves. Agnes Jackson owned 1 slave. Elias Combo owned 5 slaves. Lamb Stevens owned 13 slaves. John Dangerfield owned 2 slaves. Henry Glenn Camp owned 8 slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned 2 slaves. Nancy Lewis owned 7 slaves. So on and so forth. You get the point. If you want to read the rest, feel free to pause the video. So this ending segment right here, this is the reason why the video got banned or blocked from YouTube. Now, long story short, in this particular clip, this brother, Marvin Humes, finds out that his great-grandparents times over were slave owners. And of course, he was completely stunned and he had this complete shock look on his face because of what the mainstream media narrative has taught. Him being a so-called black man, he automatically assumes because he is black, his grandparents must have been slaves. But if you want to watch the full video, it's on my Patreon and the video is free. If you see the money options for £2, £5 and £8, that's just for donations for brothers and sisters who want to donate for my video making efforts. You do not have to donate to watch this video. So that video was just to provide a bit more context on indentured servitude. But I mentioned Abraham Lincoln, George III and George Washington were so-called black men. So 2 videos I'm going to recommend for you brothers. Now this first video is for those of you who want more details on the complexion of Abraham Lincoln. Now this video is done by a man named Camario and the video is titled The Truth About Abraham Lincoln, the Runaway Indentured Servant Colored Man. The links to that video will be in the description. Now if you want more details on the complexion of George III and George Washington, this is a video done by a man named Neophyte Dog and the video is titled Black King George III of England versus Black George Washington and the Black Colonial Soldiers of America. The link to this video will also be in the description. So let's get back to the video. I'm going to play it from the beginning.
Now, an incredible journey to learn more about my path that I recently got the opportunity to trace. I got a chance to trace my family tree way back and then hundreds of years back in a new episode of Finding Your Roots that airs tonight. And even I was shocked by some of the results. Check it out. It's the show that helps us trace our ancestry. And now it's my turn to find my roots. Just over 150 years ago, my family made history in Texas. Shankleville community, named for Jim and Winnie Shankle, known as first Newton County blacks to buy land to become local leaders after gaining freedom by emancipation.
Almost overnight, they went from being a slave to a landowner. That's amazing.
And when we trace my lineage even further back,
Royalty, I'm a king, y'all. Charlemagne is your 39th great-grandfather.
what? And I come from, the king of England, but also a king in their own rights, the Shankles.
The Shankles.
In Texas.
Yes.
Came from nothing to create something. A great family tree. Oh, thank you. It's great to have Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. from Finding Your Roots here with me this morning. And you took me on one heck of a journey, and I've always wondered, how does this start? You know, how do you begin a search like this?
Well, we have a fabulous team, a chief genealogist named Johnny Cerny, and a genetic genealogist named Cece Moore. And their work came to bear on finding your English ancestry, and I'll tell you how. We found a woman, your great-great-grandmother, named Harriet Mead, listed in the census with 8 children, but a widow. But when we looked at your DNA, it was all tracking to a family named Bishop. We went back to the paper trail, and guess what? Guess who was living next door? A white man named William Bishop.
A white man named William Bishop. How convenient. Now you already know the narrative which is going to be spun here. Now of course people are going to be asking questions as to why Michael Strahan, a so-called black man, descends from European nobility leading all the way back to Charlemagne the Great. Oh, it's because he has Caucasian lineage through his bishop line. Now let's just say that was true, which I don't think it is. This still does not negate the fact that the rulers of the Middle Ages were black people, and as a matter of fact, it will actually be the flip reverse. If it was true, he has Caucasian lineage through his bishop line. Somebody through that line actually married a black person who has lineage going back to the European nobility. But of course, in my opinion, once again, this is a narrative that they had to throw out there to explain off why Michael Strahan descends from royalty leading all the way to Charlemagne the Great. But let me replay this back.
On one heck of a journey, and I've always wondered, how does this start? You know, how do you begin a search like this?
Well, we have a fabulous team, a chief genealogist named Johnny Cerny, and a genetic genealogist named CeCe Moore. And their work came to bear on finding your English ancestry, and I'll tell you how. We found a woman, your great-great-grandmother, named Harriet Mead, listed in the census with 8 children, but a widow. But when we looked at your DNA, it was all tracking to a family named Bishop. We went back to the paper trail, and guess what? Guess who was living next door? A white man named William Bishop.
Somebody was creeping.
Yep,
Okay.
and they had sneaking and creeping, we call it. And they had 4 children together. And when we traced your ancestry back through your Bishop line, through your great-great-grandfather, we found your 11th great-grandparents got married in 1600. Shakespeare was alive. And in 1630, they then moved to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And then through them, you descend from King John of Runnymede with the Magna Carta. We found your 44th great-grandfather, who was Arnulf, the Bishop of Metz. And they're your people.
Well, I'll be honest with you, I wasn't surprised by my royal roots. But I can imagine.
So now with all this talk about Charlemagne being the 37th times over grandfather of Michael Strahan, this image is one of the most commonly used to portray Charlemagne. Now obviously, and of course, they're going to portray Charlemagne as a Caucasian. But this image is a complete fake. This is what we would call whitewashing / artistic license. They basically give themselves permission to lie about historical figures. They paint them, they portray them however they want. Just like the Book of Maccabees states, they paint the likeness of their images. And speaking of the scriptures, if they can portray Christ, Hamashiach, as a white man, what do you think they're going to do with history in general? But with that being said, let's see if we can find a more accurate portrayal of Charlemagne. So this is an illumination of Charlemagne enthroned, and as you can see, this image of Charlemagne seems to have a bit more color to him. Now what they're going to tell you, they're going to say that images like these, they got dark over time, they got dark due to old age, they got dark because they were in a monastery and they got burnt by incense smoke, they got dark because of the dust gathered on the image. These are the type of narratives and excuses they're going to come up with to try and explain off why images like these seems to have a darker complexion. Now I've already went into a bit of detail on how Charlemagne became emperor through Leo III. And that video is my Kevin Hart and the Holy Roman Empire. Does Kevin Hart know something? But going back to artifacts, sculptures, statues, paintings, frescoes, what have you, this is what they do to them: whitewashing, and they do it under the disguise of restored, restoration, refurbish, or remodeling. What they do, they hire professional artists to whitenize artifacts, and if they don't fully whitenize the artifacts, they leave them racially ambiguous to the point you can't tell. So by default, people are just going to automatically assume that civilization must have been Caucasian, because there's no way melanated people can create an advanced ancient civilization. You underestimate the lengths that these people will go to. These people will create a fake artifact, pull it in the ground somewhere in Egypt, dig it up like 2 months later, and tell you, and dig up the artifact and tell you that it's 10,000 years old. These are the lengths that these people will go to. So I was going to end the video there, but like I said, I'm working on a compilation video on the real images of the black nobility. But since I'm already here, I'm going to briefly go through a few of them. So I'm just going to get some of the Stuarts real quick. So this image is an image of King Charles I Stuart of England. Now, just for some comparison, I'm going to put him next to his whitewashed counterpart. So here's a close-up. You see the difference between the two? Now, once again, this is King Charles I of England, Stuart. So here is a carved wooden head of Charles I. So now here's a portrait of the son of Charles I, Charles II Stuart. Here's another image of Charles II. Here's a statue of Charles II, housed at Lichfield Cathedral. Here is a wax effigy of Charles II. He was also dubbed the Black Boy because this brother was extremely dark-skinned. So of course, we couldn't leave out King James Stuart, the 6th of Scotland and the 1st of England and Ireland. And of course, this is the father of Charles I and the grandfather of Charles II. So now this is coinage of the daughter of King James, Elizabeth Stuart of Bohemia. So now this is an image of the father of King James. I probably should have kept this in order so it's easy to follow along, but like I said, I'm just quickly going over some of the images. So this is the father of King James, Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart. And this is James Francis Edward Stuart. Yes, all of the Stuarts were black people, so-called black people. So this is Theodore I of Russia, the son of Ivan the Terrible. Some of you may have already seen this image if you've watched my video titled Byzantine Icons and Black Russians video. So this is Robert II, also known as Robert the Pious, King of the Franks. And this was painted by a man named Jean Fouquet or Jean Fouquet, however you pronounce that nigger's name. So this is a manuscript illumination of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. And of course, as you all should know by now, the Holy Roman Empire was ruled over by so-called black people. I know it seems like I'm rushing through these images, but like I said, I've already showed a lot of these images in past videos and I'm working on a compilation video regardless. So now let's quickly go over some of the complexions of the black nobility of Europe. So Edward I was a tall man, 6 feet 2 inches, with long arms and legs, from which his name Longshanks was derived. His hair was black like his Provençal mother's, his complexion swarthy, and his eyes fiery in anger. Now you may be saying to yourself, where does it say he was a Negro? Where does it say he was a so-called black man? Now this is why it's important, especially for you newer brothers and sisters, to understand the meaning of words and how it applies to the complexion of black people. So brothers, I've already done a video on this, but if I was to recommend a video on my channel, this video is one of the mandatory recommendations, because you brothers and sisters need to understand what these words mean and how it applies to the complexion of black people. Now the video is titled Meaning of Words: Swarthy, Tawny, Brunette, Dusky, Ruddy, Sanguine, Copper, Olive equals black people, because all those words were used to describe the variant complexions of black people. Now if you don't know the meaning of words, they can easily fool you, because for example, the word swarthy, they would tell you that the word swarthy is in reference to a Caucasian who has a deep tan or a Caucasian who is sunburned. These are the lies and narratives they're going to come up with to try and explain these words and how it applies to the complexion of black people. And a lot of you will fall for that if you don't understand how it applies to so-called black people. But like I said, even though I've already done a video on it, let's quickly get the word swarthy. The word swarthy, dark colored, especially of skin. Once again, dark colored, especially of skin, aka a so-called black man or so-called black woman. It's not talking about a Caucasian with a deep tan or a Caucasian that is sunburned. Don't let them lie to you. So now this is a physical description of Charles II, whose images we just saw previous. So the black boy, described by Parliament in a wanted poster as a tall black man, 6 feet 2 inches. James Boswell wrote the swarthy Stuart. We just went over that word. Charles' appearance, curling mouth, dark complexion, black hair and dark brown eyes. So speaking of Charles II, let's get the complexion of one of his sons. So Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, and this is from the Secret Services or Memoirs of the Secret Services of John Mackey. So Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, skipping down, he is a gentleman, good-natured to a fault, very well bred, and have many valuable things in him, is an enemy to business, very credulous, well-shaped, black complexion, much like King Charles, not 30 years old, okay, just like his father. The description of James Francis Edward Stuart. So the Avignon's chronicler describes James as light brown complexion. So this is a description of John Somers, Lord High Chancellor of England. So skipping down, he is of a grave deportment, easy and free in conversation, fomenting something, man, these old English letters, something of a libertine, of middle stature, brown complexion. The description of Anne Boleyn. Now, I've already done a full video on the complexion of Anne Boleyn, but we're just going to get this real quick. Anne was, according to contemporary sources, not a conventional beauty. One member of Henry's court wrote that Anne was not one of the most handsomest women in the world. She had a swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact, nothing but the king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful and take great effect. Her biographer, Eric William Ives, has claimed her complexion was sallow. The description of Ferdinand II of Aragon. He, a man of middle stature, well built, well formed, face on all his limbs, of smiling, clever, dark eyes, sensual lips, black hair, and what? Swarthy complexion. And here is a coin of Ferdinand II of Aragon. So I'm going to flash some family crest on the screen. Now what they're going to tell you, they're going to say that these are black African slaves that they decided to put on their family crest, which doesn't make any sense. What these actually represent, they represent the ruling class blacks that ruled over Europe during their respective time periods. So of course, we can't forget about the classic Benjamin Franklin's essay titled Observation Concerning the Increase of Mankind, written in 1751. So let's see what your boy Benjamin Frank had to say about the population in 1751. Now, I've already went over this in more detail in my Kevin Hart and the Holy Roman Empire video, so we're just going to skip down to the key parts. Now, keep in mind, Benjamin Franklin is seen as one of their greatest intellects and one of their founding forefathers, so of course, they shouldn't discredit Benjamin Franklin, right? So let's skip down to the fourth line. So why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? Now hold on a second. Shouldn't Benjamin Franklin and the Germans be the same skin complexion? Shouldn't they all so-called be white people? Why is he making a distinction between skin complexion? Let's read on. Which leads me to add one remark, that the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. All Africa is black or tawny, Asia chiefly tawny, America, exclusive of the newcomers, wholly so, and in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we would call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only excepted, who with the English make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I wish their numbers were increased. Benjamin Franklin seems to have a real problem with Caucasians who can tan. Maybe Benjamin Franklin was just extremely jealous that they could get a tan and he couldn't, because when he tries to get a tan, he just gets sunburned. Because there's no way this is talking about so-called black people. It's talking about Caucasians with a dark tan. Because it makes total sense that Benjamin Franklin was beefing with other Caucasians because they could tan and he couldn't. Now, of course, I'm just joking, but these are the type of reasonings they're going to come to, because of course they can't discredit Benjamin Franklin. Like I said, he's one of their greatest intellects and one of their founding forefathers. But like I said, I already went over this in more detail in my Kevin Hart and the Holy Roman Empire video. You can skip to the 23 minutes and 15 second mark on that video. Hopefully this was an edifying lesson. For those of you brothers and sisters who want to support me financially through donations for my video making efforts, you can donate to me on Cash App or Patreon. Giving all praises to the Most High Yahweh, in the name of Yahweh Shai. Deuces.